Hi everyone, Rick Russell here. Stand by for channel markers. Last week, Jack and Ryan indulged in some Monday morning quarterbacking of the Navy's shipbuilding decisions by asking what capital ships the Navy could have done without during World War II. Hindsight being 2020, a few viewers called foul. Because of the fast pace of events and improvements to naval technology from 1937, when North Carolina was laid down and the main carrier fighter was a biplane, to 1943, when Admiral King canceled the Montana-class and the main carrier fighter was the Hellcat, we shouldn't judge decision makers too harshly. Modern air power had arrived, and the imbalance between battleships and carriers was now all too real. Our actual question asked was, did we build too many ships? The answer is yes in some cases, no in others. So what happened? We won't solve this puzzle in one episode, but let's start by looking at the Navy's predicament on New Year's Day, 1942. At this stage in the war, large, big gun warships had not fared well against aircraft or submarines. When Japanese aircraft deleted 5 old battleships from the U.S. Navy's order of battle during the raid on Pearl Harbor, then shockingly sank the far more capable Prince of Wales and Repulse in open water, even old-timers agreed the long envisioned day of aircraft dominating big guns at sea had arrived. In the first 28 months of fighting, for example, the Royal Navy lost 8 capital ships and carriers combined, but enemy gunfire claimed only 2 of them. Facing a major carrier war in the Pacific, the U.S. Navy opened 1942 with 5 fleet carriers, 2 older Lexington-class carriers, and 3 of the relatively new Yorktown class. In a pinch, the Navy could push Wasp into the front line, making 6. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor with 6 carriers. More carriers were coming, only not fast enough. The Navy laid the keels for its first 5 Essex-class fleet carriers, as well as the first 5 smaller Independence-class carriers, an emergency design built on light cruiser hulls, during 1941. The U.S. Navy had more big gun ships coming online than carriers. In the 16 months between April 1941 and August 1942, 6 fast battleships, but only 1 fleet carrier were commissioned. The first 4 Iowa-class battleships were also under construction. A 5th Iowa would be laid down in March 1942. By the way, during the same period, the Navy commissioned only 6 cruisers, all light, and 4 of those were of the AA variety. Is it any wonder the new fast battleships were used like heavy cruisers in the second half of 1942? Circumstances had changed dramatically since the war started in Europe. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940 was based on a potential catastrophe. The legislation anticipated a worst-case scenario in which the U.S. Navy would need to fight the Axis navies alone, and with them possibly in possession of the French and even the British fleets. Though France surrendered, its big ships had not fallen into German hands, nor had Great Britain folded under the weight of relentless German bombing, and the Royal Navy was still fighting heroically. There's a popular belief that after Japan had wakened the sleeping industrial giant by attacking Pearl Harbor, the Navy was afforded virtually unlimited resources to build the largest naval fighting force in history, one that overwhelmed its enemies and humbled its allies. While the idea has a ring of truth to it, the nation's resources weren't unlimited. In response to Pearl Harbor, wild proposals about building 36 battleships and some 40 fleet carriers were quickly rejected. The existing building ways were already full. In fact, battleship armor and large turbines were in short supply. As a result, Congress supplemented existing appropriations carefully by authorizing the Navy to build another 150,000 tons of combatant shipping, which it used to order 2 more fleet carriers and 42 smaller ships. That might have been large enough of a commitment on paper, but coping with the rapid pace of changing priorities, improved technology, fierce competition for material and personnel resources with the other services, combat losses, sustainability, the general uncertainty, and the law of unintended consequences increasingly complicated the Navy's best-laid plans. Speaking of combat losses, Of those 6 pre-war carriers, Saratoga was torpedoed in January, sidelining her until summer. Lexington was lost at Coral Sea in May, and Yorktown was sunk at Midway in June. Meanwhile, the Navy suffered from an imbalance between battleships and carriers, didn't have enough cruisers, and, lest we forget the Battle of the Atlantic, needed hundreds of escort ships. Now we begin to understand the true meaning of the miracle at Midway, when U.S. carrier aircraft sank 4 of the 6 Japanese fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor in a single battle. Not surprisingly, back in Washington, the Navy began to slow roll work on the final 2 Iowa-class battleships, the entire Montana-class, and 3 of the Alaska-class large cruisers. Creating a balanced fleet of an appropriate size while managing available resources was an enormous task, impossible to relate in a relatively short video, but the main participants were the Navy's General Board, which was still inclined toward battleships, President Roosevelt, a dabbler in the Navy's business who wanted smaller ships, especially smaller carriers, because they used less steel, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, and Admirals King and Nimitz. In the end, sometimes with Knox acting as a go-between with the President, Admiral King got the final word. Decision-making became much easier in July 1942 when a revolutionary naval expansion bill, the last of the war, was sponsored by the Navy's greatest advocate in Congress, Representative Carl Vinson, and passed with little debate. Vinson's name had appeared on all major naval expansion legislation going back to 1934. To the Navy, he was a political superhero who deserved to have a supercarrier named for him. The legislation pushed the Navy to build more carriers, more cruisers, and hundreds of destroyer escorts. Battleships were excluded. It, and a companion bill for naval auxiliaries, authorized the Navy to build more than 3 million additional tons. Significantly, and here's the beauty of it, the legislation allowed the Navy to replace the combat loss of one type of ship sunk with another type of ship, or with a mix of ships whose tonnage added up to the tonnage of the lost ship. Even better, the act retroactively allowed the Navy to treat ships authorized under previous legislation the same way. In other words, the Navy might trade a battleship authorized in 1940 for 2 new carriers and several destroyers. For 3 years, Navy leaders would enjoy the luxury of adjusting their massive building program with almost no oversight from Congress, transferring tonnage and ordering and canceling ships as they saw fit. In July 1942, Knox asked the President for permission to place orders for 14 carriers, 33 cruisers, and more than 500 destroyers and destroyer escorts. By the end of the summer, the Navy had a building program of unprecedented size underway. Even Roosevelt abandoned his preference for small carriers to approve the first Midway. As of November 1942, by which time the 6 pre-war carriers had been whittled down to 2, the battle-damaged Enterprise and aging Saratoga, and still with no Essex-class carriers in sight, King's 1946 Navy promised to fill the horizon with, barring losses, 39 carriers, including 4 Midways, 36 battleships and Alaska-class large cruisers, although 10 of these were on hold, 108 other cruisers, 500 destroyers, 114 escort carriers, 314 subs, and 750 escort ships. While the Navy and Marines were still fighting for Guadalcanal and the Battle of the Atlantic raged with no end in sight, who could say if the Navy was overbuilding or not? On the final day of 1942, a year in which the Navy commissioned 4 battleships and launched 2 more, USS Essex CV-9 was placed in commission, perhaps more for appearance's sake than any measure of her completion. A long 14 months had passed since the commissioning of the previous carrier, Hornet, and she was already lost. But 1943 would be an entirely different year, and keeping his massive 1946 Navy intact would prove to be a major challenge for Admiral King. Finally, as always, we tip our hats to the men of the pre-war Navy who held the line in 1942. That's all for this channel marker. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment or recommend another subject below. As always, Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.